Good morning, I'm Dave Christie with your LaRouche Organization Daily Update for Thursday, November 13th. I'm going to focus on a false flag provocation or attempted false flag provocation by the British to hijack a Russian Mig-31 armed with Kinzhal missiles and apparently fly it to the border of Romania where it could be shot down potentially. I'll cover some of the details on that, but I think this reflects the level of desperation that we have from the City of London and Wall Street as they see their geopolitical control slipping in light of the collapse of the transatlantic casino system of the unpayable quadrillions of derivatives and so forth. Now, I'll cover some of Sergei Lavrov's comments on this false flag operation by the British that was thwarted by the FSB, the Internal Security Service of Russia. But I also want to cover some of what Lavrov had to say concerning the recent statements by Trump on the U.S. resuming nuclear testing. Now, we still don't know what that actually means, whether that's, testing the systems, delivery systems, and so forth related to nuclear weapons or actual explosive detonating atomic devices and so on. Now, just to cover this, the basic plot of this hijacking it was unclear what it would actually have looked like, but of the MiG-31, again, armed with Kinzhal missiles, which should be noted that Kinzhals are a hypersonic vehicle, but also are capable of carrying nuclear warheads. So what the plot was is either recruit a Russian pilot with a $3 million payoff and, a European passport to some country unnamed, but to fly this MiG-31, or there's an alternative theory that perhaps the pilot would have been given flight plans that would have brought it to the Constanta, Romania air base, which is one of or a NATO base. It's, in fact, I believe the largest NATO base in all of Europe. But the basic scenario is that this, MiG-31 armed with the Kinzhal would fly towards this NATO base, and the ensuing response would have occurred, either a shoot down of the Russian fighter jet or potentially even worse response, which of course would ignite the fears of a direct NATO-Russia clash with escalations very quickly up to the nuclear threshold, if not immediately to the nuclear threshold. I should just be noted that Romania also is home to the U.S. missile defense systems that were set up under George W. Bush, littered throughout Europe, supposedly in response to threats from Iran. But when approached by Vladimir Putin back in the day, this is early 2000s, Putin suggested, well, if you're concerned about Iran, we could do joint operations inside of Azerbaijan, which we have good relationships with, and therefore you would be right on the edge of Iran. Now, that proposal at that time was rejected. Putin's proposal, that is, was rejected by the Bush administration, and instead these so-called missile defense systems, and some of them Aegis class capability, of the Aegis systems. Anyway, these are also systems that can be converted into offensive systems, including potentially those that carry nuclear warheads. So this has been a long-standing issue, but obviously the point of this British-led provocation would be to draw the United States directly into the battle, into this NATO-Ukraine battle, which of course there's been indications, at least stated by Trump, that he has no willingness to join in what he recently described would have been a World War III scenario. So let me just state what Russian Foreign Ministry Sergei Lavrov had to say of this. He said that the FSB, the Federal Security Service of Russia, reported on November 11th that they had thwarted an operation by the Ukrainian Defense Ministry's main intelligence directorate and its UK supervisors to hijack a Russian Mig-31 supersonic fighter jet. So I think important that the Russians are naming the British in this plot, which is not a surprise to us here at the LaRouche organization. He went on to say that London's penchant for provoking situations, of course, is notorious. Take the recent, and then went on to describe that scenario of the hijacking or changing the flight paths, or however it would have been for the Russian Mig-31. And then he went on to say that I don't know how the British will wash away the stain, but they've always had a remarkable talent for this, like a duck that waddles away from a shower without a drop of water on its back. And then Lavrov went on to say this: the former empire that once ruled most of the world is gone, and so is the good old England, perhaps merry old England in the translation they so love to parade. They have little economic weight left, and their military might is relatively weak, as even their nuclear arsenal, isn't fully under their control. They have to compensate for this weakness somehow, so they fall back on the traditional English aspiration to divide and conquer, to put it politely. There are, of course, less charitable terms for their actions and goals. So that's what Lavrov had to say on this particular incident. But he also went on, or just in the recent period, perhaps in the same presentation, discussed the whole issue of the United States resuming nuclear weapons testing. Now, as I mentioned earlier, it's unclear what the Trump administration intends by that, whether that's the testing of the delivery systems or the actual explosion of nuclear devices. That's yet to be clarified from the Trump administration. But what Lavrov referred to in this context was a dangerous statement by Robert Kadlec, who said that Trump's decision, he said this back on November 4th during a confirmation hearing, for his position as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear Deterrence Policy and Chemical and Biological Defense Programs. Kadlec, just so you recall, was supposedly one of the architects of Trump's warp speed that was implemented around the so-called COVID crisis. But anyway, during Kadlec's confirmation hearing on November 4th, he said that Trump's decision was driven by, quote, geopolitical considerations. When he was discussing this, he said what was the reasoning for this. He went through a couple of the reasons, basic testing capabilities to see if things were up to speed. But then he said that the third one, the option of why we would be testing the nuclear weapons, he said the third one seems to be whether there's geopolitical context or reasons to do that. Now, what Lavrov said of Kadlec's statement, I think, is fairly concerning, to say the least. Lavrov said concerning Kadlec's statement, he said that President Trump's decision to resume nuclear tests are driven by geopolitical considerations. As before, there is no technical need to conduct such tests. That's a strong statement. I'm not sure whether the speaker himself realizes the gravity of what he said, but we are compelled to interpret this as confirmation of what he has been saying all along, which is that there's no technical necessity for such tests. He went on to say that the goal was geopolitical and thus drove home the point for us. So essentially, Lavrov is saying there's no technical reasons to do it. This is about geopolitics. And then Lavrov said, what may the geopolitical goal of the United States look like? Domination, right? The use of nuclear weapons argument in this setting is alarming and represents a significant departure from the concept once agreed upon by Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev, where a nuclear war cannot be won and therefore must never be fought. So this is how the Russians are viewing the present relations, particularly around the issue of nuclear warfare and its stated geopolitical intentions around these testing. And I think to consider then in this context the provocation by the British, whatever deep state alliances, and of course their puppet regime inside of Ukraine. Now, I think that as we well know, the American people do not want these geopolitical confrontations nor the ensuing endless wars that result from them. And that is exactly why they voted for Donald Trump. On the flip side, and I think there's a lot of swirling questions about whether Trump is, a captured asset, has always been an asset of the deep state. People have their different concerns. On the flip side, some question how much control Donald Trump or any American president actually has over the government or over the executive branch. Certainly the rest of the government appears to be abdicating its responsibilities, particularly around the role of the authorization for any sort of war. That resides solely within Congress, according to the founding fathers that had set that up to ensure that be a broad-based discussion for miring us into any kind of wars. But, on the question of the American presidency, I'm going to refer to the statement from George Stephanopoulos a few years back, where he stated that in response to the J6, the January 6th so-called insurrection, which increasingly looks more like a Fed-surrection as it's being called, that is FBI involvement and other government agencies being involved in that provocation. But in response to that, in an interview that George Stephanopoulos did, who, should be stated, he's perhaps of the mockingbird status of journalists, if you want to call them that. But he basically raised the question said that after the January 6th event, that the United States was already in it, that was the continuity of government was invoked. Now, whether that was a temporary thing, it was invoked apparently after the events of September 11th, 2001. Was that temporary? These are questions we don't know, but what we do know is that, in all of this, whether this be the, very small grouping within the elite deep state continuity of government, secret government apparatus, whatever you want to call it, what we do know about all of this is that we are many and they are few, according to what Percy Bysshe Shelley laid out many centuries ago, or a couple centuries ago. Now, what we do know is that in this kind of a moment, it is ideas that, and always in the human history, ideas determine the course of human history. And we have the ideas that can resolve these geopolitical crises, can resolve the economic disintegration that is very advanced in terms of the Casino Royale system of the City of London and Wall Street, their unpayable derivatives that number in the quadrillions. We can deal with this crisis according to LaRouche's 4 laws. Now, and I think that indicates the better side of the United States and those presidents that in the past, as a reflection of the American people that they represent, whether that be George Washington, John Quincy Adams, Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt, and frankly, Lyndon LaRouche himself, who though was not actually ever president, represented the presidency in the same way that Benjamin Franklin did. And what we have to do as the American people and frankly citizens of the world is put forward those ideas that can resolve this crisis, one of which is on the table, the Bering Strait Tunnel proposal that Kirill Dmitriev put on the table in the recent period. That is exactly the kind of perspective that that will resolve these global crises. Now, on the matter of the idea content, we held a major conference in Paris. Helga Zepp-LaRouche discussed that in her webcast yesterday, but this was young people of the world who demanded that and took responsibility that they are going to be the future leadership of a world based on development and a peace through development perspective. So I encourage you to watch Helga Zepp-LaRouche's webcast from yesterday, where she developed some of what occurred at that conference, in addition to her strategic overview, and otherwise stay tuned to the LaRouche organization.